So when you think about schools, what's the first image that pops into your head? Is it like a well-oiled machine, maybe all efficient and designed, or maybe more like a factory, just churning out graduates year after year? Well, today we're actually going to really challenge that whole traditional view. We're doing a deep dive into this really fascinating paper. It's from Dr. Debarshi Roy, who's a behavioral scientist and founder at Empathy Diagnostics. And the title is Schools That Breathe, Rethinking Schools as Living Systems. So our mission today, it's really to dig into what happens when we stop seeing schools as these sort of static machines and start viewing them as, well, dynamic, interconnected living organisms. How does that change things?
Yeah, and maybe before we jump straight into schools, it's good to just quickly touch on what living systems actually are. So this idea, it comes originally from James Greer Miller, and then folks like Fritjof Capra, Humberto Maturana, they kind of built on it.
Hmm.
And the core concept, well, think of things that are, complex, self-organizing, they adapt, they really thrive on relationships and feedback. The key thing is they are never static.
Yeah.
That's the huge difference from, say, a machine, like a forest maybe, or even our own bodies, always changing, learning, all the parts depending on each other. They evolve, they learn from feedback, and the quality of the relationships between the parts is just fundamental.
Okay, so this whole living systems idea for schools, it sounds really powerful, right? In theory. But thinking practically, with all the rules and, standardized demands schools face,
Yeah.
how realistic is it actually to apply this? What are some of the big hurdles the paper points out?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question because our usual way of
The
thinking.
default mode.
Yeah, exactly. The default mode is often that machine metaphor, isn't it?
Mm.
The rigid hierarchies, the input-output idea of
So
education.
top-down policies, standardized testing.
Right. And a paper really argues that this just, it misses the point. It misses the vibrant, dynamic nature of these places. So the biggest hurdle is probably that ingrained way of thinking itself. The paper basically says schools are way more like living organisms than machines, and it gives, well, 5 pretty compelling reasons why this perspective isn't just theory, it's actually essential.
5 reasons. Okay, let's get into them. What's the first one?
Okay, so first up is the interconnectedness of roles and relationships. Just like, every organ in your body contributes to the whole system functioning. In a school, it's the same. Every single part matters. Students, teachers, administrators, the support staff, parents, even the wider community, they all contribute. And the paper gives this great example. Think about a teacher who gets really good mentorship and just emotional support. Well, that support doesn't just stay with the teacher, it ripples out. Their classroom actually becomes a safer space. Kids get more engaged.
So it affects the students directly.
Directly. You often see better learning outcomes, even lower absenteeism. It just shows how deeply interdependent all those relationships really are.
Okay, interconnectedness, that makes sense. What's the second reason?
Second is self-organization and emergence. This is really interesting. Schools aren't just following some rigid blueprint handed down from on high. They show this incredible ability to self-organize. Think about things like teacher groups forming organically to share what works in the classroom.
Right, like professional learning communities, but maybe less formal sometimes.
Exactly. Or student-led initiatives, clubs, projects, even specific classroom rituals that teachers and students develop together. Peer mentoring programs. A lot of this stuff isn't mandated. It just sort of emerges from the internal culture, from the way the system works together.
So it bubbles up from within rather than being imposed.
Precisely. These are called emergent properties, and they're a classic sign of a living system. Like, imagine a few students get passionate about the environment and start a club.
Yeah.
That club might then kickstart bigger changes like getting the whole school into waste segregation or water conservation or just raising awareness about eco-literacy. Powerful stuff, and it wasn't necessarily in the original plan.
Okay, so interconnectedness, self-organization. What's number 3?
The third one is learning and adaptation. This is maybe the most obvious link. Living systems learn from experience, right? And schools absolutely do that too, or at least they should. They look at how teaching practices are working, they reflect on student data, they have to adapt to crises.
Like the pandemic, that was a huge forced adaptation.
Massive one. That sudden shift to hybrid learning, a truly static, rigid system just couldn't have handled that kind of disruption. Schools have to evolve, otherwise they become, well, irrelevant pretty quickly. Think about a school that actually listens to student feedback when planning things.
Student voice, yeah.
That school becomes much more agile, much more responsive. It's less likely to get stuck with outdated ways of teaching or stuff that just doesn't connect with the kids' lives anymore.
That makes sense. Adaptation is key to survival. So what's the fourth point?
Fourth, schools are open systems. They don't exist in a vacuum. They're constantly interacting with their environment, the social environment, political, cultural, even the ecological one.
Right, they're part of the community.
Exactly. And this interdependence means schools need to be sort of permeable, open to new ideas, inclusive of different perspectives, really reflecting the values and needs of their community. The paper mentions rural schools as an example, when they successfully weave in local knowledge, maybe local languages, into what they teach.
It makes it more relevant.
Hugely relevant. They often see much higher student engagement, and the students feel a stronger sense of who they are, of their identity, because the school feels connected to their world.
Okay. Open systems interacting with their environment. And the fifth reason.
Finally, number 5 is about purpose and meaning. Living systems generally have some kind of goal, right? They're directed towards something, like survival or flourishing. And schools, similarly, shouldn't just be about academic results, like just churning out test scores.
There has to be more to it.
Absolutely. The purpose needs to be broader. Nurturing well-being, fostering civic responsibility, helping kids grow as whole people. The paper really stresses that education can't just be exams. It has to involve making meaning, feeling like you belong, and really flourishing as a human being.
Those 5 points paint a really different picture of a school, not a machine at all. And the paper then brings in this really interesting idea. It talks about the binding energy needed to hold these living school systems together, comparing it to like biochemical signals in a body that keep things in balance. And that binding energy is empathy.
Exactly. Empathy is positioned as this crucial sort of social and emotional glue in these systems. It's what binds people, students, teachers, everyone together. It allows people to respond sensitively to each other, especially during stress. It builds that feeling of safety, and it helps everyone kind of co-regulate, manage their emotions together within the system.
How does that play out practically?
Well, for students, empathy means they feel seen, they feel heard. And that builds trust, which makes them more open to learning, less resistant. For teachers, empathy helps them tailor what they're doing. They can better read the room, understand students' emotional states, their cognitive states, and adjust. For administrators, it helps them see past the numbers maybe, understand the real systemic barriers people are facing, and respond more humanely.
And between students.
Oh, hugely important there. It fosters that peer-to-peer compassion. You see less bullying, less exclusion when empathy is strong. The source actually defines empathy in a really neat systems way. Empathy, energy plus information.
Energy plus information. What does that mean?
So think about systems needing flows of energy and information to work, right? Empathy acts like a really clean signal. It carries vital social information about needs, feelings, perspectives. Without it, the emotional energy in the system gets messy, chaotic. The paper calls it emotional entropy.
Ah, like disorder increasing.
Exactly. And that leads to breakdown, dysfunction. It's like signals getting crossed in a biological system. Things start to fail. But when empathy is flowing well, trust gets built. Performance tends to stabilize. And burnout for teachers, for admin, even for students, actually decreases.
Okay, so empathy is this vital flow of energy and information. What happens then when it's missing? When that flow breaks down? The paper makes a pretty strong case that in schools that are struggling, the real missing piece often isn't the curriculum or the building. It's this empathic feedback. Teachers feel like nobody's listening, students feel invisible, parents feel shut out. The feedback loops just aren't working or they're distorted.
That's right. Without those functioning empathic feedback loops, the living system starts to, decay. It can't regulate itself properly. And you see the signs of that decay all over the place, don't you? Things like absenteeism, high staff turnover, burnout, apathy. These are often symptoms of that deep emotional disconnection.
And the paper connects this to standardized testing too, right? Saying it doesn't build resilience on its own.
Yeah, that's a key point. Standardized testing, especially when it's high stakes and lacks emotional support or scaffolding. It doesn't necessarily build true resilience. Resilience is about bouncing back, adapting, growing stronger through stress.
Okay.
What high-pressure testing without support can sometimes create is more like stress resistance.
Stress resistance, what's the difference?
It's like a grim endurance. People might push through, grit their teeth and get it done, sure. But often the cost is burnout, disengagement, apathy down the line. They're not recovering or learning from the stress in a healthy way. They're just resisting it until they break or burn out.
So just pushing through isn't the same as adapting and growing stronger.
Not at all. True resilience needs that supportive, empathic environment to develop.
This raises a big question then. If empathy is so vital, how do we make it more than just, individual acts of kindness? How does it become part of the system?
Right. And that's where the paper talks about systemic empathy. The argument is that empathy in schools can't just be left to chance or to individual personalities. It needs to be structural,
Structural, meaning.
meaning it needs to be deliberately embedded in the school's norms, its policies, even its physical architecture, its daily schedules, the stories it tells about itself. It's about designing the entire system with empathy in mind, not just hoping individual teachers will be empathetic.
Can you give some examples of what that might look like?
Sure, it could mean things like designing classrooms to actually promote inclusive dialogue and connection, not just rows facing forward. It could mean policies that explicitly acknowledge things like trauma or neurodiversity and provide real support, not just labels. It means leadership that models listening, that actively seeks out different perspectives, reflects on them, and really engages with the whole school, community, students, staff, parents.
So it's baked into how the school operates.
Exactly. Even things like assessment, moving towards ways of evaluating learning that value progress, effort, and individual growth over just getting a perfect score on one particular day. When empathy becomes systemic like that, it's woven into the very fabric of the school. It's not just an optional extra. It's fundamental to how things work.
Wow. Okay. So when you put all of this together, thinking about schools as living systems, fueled by systemic empathy, the implications for how we try to improve schools seem, well, pretty radical compared to the old ways.
Oh, absolutely. If you contrast this living systems view with a traditional sort of mechanistic view of school reform, the differences are really stark. The paper highlights a few key contrasts.
Let's hear them.
Okay, so the mechanistic approach. It usually favors top-down change. The thinking is often, we need to fix the teachers or implement this new program everywhere.
Standardize and roll out?
Right, but the living systems view, it promotes more distributed leadership. The focus shifts to how can we support the entire ecosystem? How can we nurture the connections and capacities already there?
So less fixing individuals, more nurturing the environment.
Exactly. Then look at goals. The mechanistic view loves standardized goals. Deliver this syllabus, meet these targets. The living systems view, though, prioritizes context-sensitive growth. It's about co-creating learning that's relevant and meaningful in that specific place for those specific people.
More adaptable.
Much more. And behavior. The old machine model is often about behavior control, right? Punishing bad behavior to enforce compliance.
Zero tolerance, consequences.
Yeah. But a living systems approach focuses more on emotional regulation. It asks, what's the unmet need behind this behavior? It tries to understand and support rather than just control.
Well, that's a big shift.
It is. And evaluation, too. The mechanistic model is heavily evaluation-focused. Track the results, measure the outputs. The living systems perspective is more reflection-focused. It wants to nurture growth over the long term, understanding that learning is a process, not just an outcome.
Less about judgment, more about development.
You could say that, and maybe the biggest one. The mechanistic view can lead to this isolation of parts. People thinking, that's not my department, or that's not my problem.
Silos.
Exactly, silos. But a living systems view inherently understands the interdependence of everyone. The mindset becomes, we are all in this together. My well-being affects yours, and the student's success depends on all of us working together.
So, pulling this all together, the core message seems incredibly profound, really. It's saying schools aren't these predictable pipelines or production units. They're actually dynamic ecosystems, living, breathing networks of relationships. They thrive on feedback, they run on care, they grow, they get hurt sometimes, they heal, they adapt, they can even surprise us.
That sums it up beautifully. And if we start treating them like the living systems they are, paying attention to the feedback, offering care, approaching them with curiosity, and making empathy central,
Yeah.
then they don't just manage to survive, they can genuinely thrive. There's that powerful metaphor from the source paper that really sticks with you.
The garden metaphor.
Yeah. Instead of trying to manage schools like complex machines, maybe we should be tending to them like gardens. Because at the end of the day, kids aren't products coming off an assembly line. They're people. And people, like plants in a garden, tend to grow best when they feel seen, supported, nourished, and safe.
Tending schools like gardens. That's a powerful image to end on. So for everyone listening, here's something to think about. If you start viewing schools through this lens as living systems, what might you notice differently in the schools or educational places around you? And how might that change the way you think about supporting them or getting involved?